Hello everybody. Today's presentation is shedding light on one of the most important and significant poems written by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It is A Frost at Midnight, which belongs to the personal poems group. In this presentation will include three parts. The first is the introduction to the poem, the second is the critical summary, as well as the third point, the critical appreciation about the poem Frost at Midnight. So starting by the introduction of this poem, which is going to contain or includes 5 points that are very significant to the study of the poems, or to the poem that is written by Coleridge, or Frost at Midnight. So we have, all students should learn that the poem is written to celebrate the birth of the poet's son, Hartley. The second point of this introduction, that it is written in contemplative mode, as well as Frost at Midnight is an autobiographical poem that is going to include different information about the personal life of the poet and his son, as well as his family. By the way, Coleridge in his Frost at Midnight, he uses a blank verse with descriptive kinds of passages. The last point of this introduction is the attitude and the description of nature in A Frost at Midnight. So A Frost at Midnight is written by Coleridge to celebrate the birth of his son Hartley at Stowe in 1798, and it was first published with For Fear in Solitude and France an Ode. The poem is written in contemplative mode. The atmosphere, as described in the poem, is perfectly peacefully and calm, and there is nothing to disturb it. This quietness of the night is maintained throughout the poem, and the poet's thoughts are also mild and gentle in a similar manner. No violence, in fact, of thought occurs to disturb the harmony of this or of the poet's mind. The poem also has autobiographical interest. The poet's thoughts wander back to his own past, when he was a student at the Christ's Hospital School, and fondly believed in certain popular superstitions. Not only does the poet think about his past life, he also looks forward and tries to guess the future of his son Hartley. Hartley, who, as he hopes, would pass his life in the constant company of nature and would lead a peaceful and happy life. His son would learn from nature that eternal values of life. The poem is written in charming blank verse and contains many very fine descriptive passages. In this poem, Coleridge's attitude toward nature shows a distinct impact of, or an influence of, Wordsworth. He, like Wordsworth, finds nature sympathetic to man, as the thin blue film that flutters has dim sympathies with him. He wishes for his son Hartley to develop intimate and living contact with nature that wield the great power of a man's life. Nature is the greatest teacher of man. He wants nature to the universal teacher to mold and shape the spirit of his son. Again, Coleridge in this poem expresses his religious philosophy. The philosophy that he believed that God is present everywhere and in all the objects of this world or objects of this world. The beautiful sights and sounds of nature are representation of God who speaks to us through them, and it is for us to pay attention to them and understand their meaning and significance. The poem shows so much Wordsworth's influence on Coleridge that when a critic goes to the extent of saying that its closing lines might have flowed straight from the pen of Wordsworth himself. This is what concerns the first part of the presentation, that includes or talking about a short introduction to the poem Frost at Midnight. The second part of this presentation is concerning the critical summary of each part of the poem. So the first part of this poem: the frost performs its secret ministry. Unheld by any wind, the owl's cry came loud and hark, again loud as before, the inmates of my cottage all at rest, having left me to that solitude which suits abstruser's musings, gave that at my save at that at my side, my cradled infant slumbers peacefully. 'Tis calm indeed, so calm that it disturbs and vexes meditation with its strange and extreme silentness. Sea, hill, and wood, this populous village, sea and hill and wood, with all the numberless goings on of life, inaudible as a dream, the thin blue flame lies on my low burnt fire and quivers not. Only the film which flattered on the grate still flatters there the soul unquiet thing. Methinks its motion in this hush of nature give it dim sympathies with me who live, making it a companionable form, whose puny flaps and freaks the idling spirit by its own mood interprets everywhere, echoes or mirror seeking of itself, and makes a toy of thoughts. Definitely in this part, the poem presents the abstruse musing of Coleridge on a frosty night spent alone by his fireside. The poet looks around him and finds that all the inmates of his cottage have fallen asleep, leaving him in perfect solitude. His little son, Hartley, is peacefully sleeping in a cradle by his side. Complete silence prevailing all around him suddenly becomes a little oppressive, for he feels that it fixes meditation instead of promoting it. For a while his mind leaves his cottage and flies around in the world at large to discover the sea, or that the sea, hill, and wood are all steeped in silence, and the numberless goings on of life are suspended, are inaudible as a dream. Inside the cottage, the fire has burnt itself low. Only the small film is fluttering on the grate. This film is the only other wakeful thing there, and the poet feels that a bond of sympathy exists between the two. I mean the film of the fire and the poet himself. Its movement makes it companionable. The poet, playing with his thoughts, abandons himself to random musing, interpreting the puny flaps and the freaks of the film according to his own mood. The second part of the poem: but oh, how oft at school with most believing mind Presageful have I gazed upon the bars, to watch that fluttering stranger, and as oft, with unclosed lids, already had I dreamt of my sweet birthplace and the old church tower, whose bells the poor man's only music rang, from morn to evening all the hot fair day, so sweetly that they stirred and haunted me, with a wild pleasure falling on mine ear, most like articulate sounds of things to come. So gazed I, till the soothing things I dreamt lulled me to sleep, and sleep prolonged my dreams. And so I brooded all the following morn, awed by the stern preceptor's face, mine eye fixed with mock study on my swimming book, save if the door half opened, and I snatched a hasty glance, and still my heart leaped up, for still I hoped to see the stranger's face, townsman, or aunt, or sisters more beloved, my playmate when we both were clothed alike. In the second section of the poem, the poet now gets into a reminiscent mood. The sight of the fluttering film takes him back to his childhood days, or to the school days he spent in the Christus Hospital School. He remembers that at school, whenever he saw his or this fluttering film on the grate, he superstitiously believed that he would have a visitor the next day. He also thought of the village, with the church bells running throughout the day on the occasion of some fair there. Next day at school he would pretend to be reading carefully, but he would all the time be expecting a townsman, a relative, or a friend, or his beloved sister, with whom he had been playing in his childhood. After every little while he would steal a hasty glance at the door, expecting the appearance of a visitor there. The third part of the poem, Frost at Midnight. Dear baby that sleepest cradle by my side, whose gentle breathings, heard in this deep calm, fill up the interspersed vacancies and momentary pauses of the thoughts. My baby so beautiful, it thrills my heart with tender gladness, thus to look at thee, and think that thou shalt learn far other law, and in far other scenes, for I was reared in the great city, bent mid-cloister dim, and so not lovely but the sky and the stars. But thou, my baby, shalt wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountain, and beneath the clouds, which image in their bulk both lakes and shores, and mountains' crags. So shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who from eternity doth teach himself in all, and all things in himself, great universal teacher. He shall mold thy spirit, and by giving make it ask. In this part there is address to the poet, or the poet addressing his son Hartley Coleridge, now who is peacefully sleeping in the cradle. He remembers how he was himself brought up in the suffocating atmosphere of London, where amid dim cloister he saw no lovely but the sky and the stars. He regrets that he has been deprived of deprived of and makes an entirely different plan for the upbringing of his son. His son will be brought up in entirely different surrounding and will be given an entirely different knowledge. He will have the freedom of wandering about in the company of nature, along the lakes and the sandy shores, or under the eminence as the lakes and shores themselves. He will grow up under the benevolence and educative influence of nature. The sweet sounds heard in nature constitute the eternal language in which God reveals himself to mankind. Therefore, God, acting through the medium of nature, will himself mold the character of his son and develop in him a keen desire to submit himself to the moral and educative influence of nature. These lines were obviously written under the influence of Wordsworth. They contain the benetheistic belief that a divine spirit pervades all objects of nature and that God reveals himself through nature. This further leads to the idea that nature is capable of exerting a moral influence on human beings. The last part of the poem, the fourth one: therefore all seasons shall be sweet to thee, whether the summer clothe the general earth with greenness, or the redbreast sit and sing betwixt the tufts of snow on the bare branch of mossy apple tree, while the night thatch smokes and the sun's thaw, whether the eve drops fall, heard only in the torrents of the blast, or if the secret ministry of a frost shall hang them up in silence icicles, quietly shining to the quiet moon. The last part of the poem, there is now a very gentle transition in thought process. The poet says that under the influence of nature, his son will come to love all the seasons equally well. Whether the earth is covered with green verdure in the summer season, or the redbreast sits on a leafless apple tree in winter and sings its songs, while the drops of water falling from the roofs of the cottage freeze into icicles that shine quietly in the quiet moonlight. His son will be fascinated by all these spectacles of nature. The third part of the poem, which is so much significance to the study of Frost at Midnight, is the critical appreciation of Frost at Midnight. The poem Frost at Midnight, as we have stated before, written by Coleridge, and it is one of the finest short poems in the English language. It is much loved and much praised. However, it is doubtful, as Humphrey House thinks, if it has been adequately understood and appreciated as a perfectly achieved work of art, which in reality it is. What makes the poem an achieved artistic whole is the design and unity in the movements of the poet's thoughts. So the the appreciation for this poem, or the praise for this poem, is going to rest on four main points in this discussion of the critical analysis of the poem. The first of these is going to be setting and the atmosphere of the poem. The second will be the autobiographical elements and reminiscences in the poem. Third, Coleridge's attitude towards nature and his love to nature and its description. And the last one is the meditative quality in the poem. Starting by the first point of this discussion, setting and atmosphere of A Frost at Midnight. The poem has been set in a very quiet and peaceful atmosphere. It is the time of midnight and the frost is fulfilling its work secretly and unheld by any wind. The poet reflects upon the absolute stillness or silentness of the night, broken only by the owl's cry. It is so quiet. That's why it disturbs and vexes meditation with its strange and extreme silentness. All the inmates of the cottage are sleeping, and the poet has been left to that solitude which suits abstruser musings. This silent atmosphere makes the poet reflective and meditative, and he is led to discover the affinity between himself and the film fluttering on the grate. There is a feeling of sympathy between the poets and this film, because both are awake and active. The idle spirits of the poet interprets the irregular movements of the film according to his own moods and whims, so that the film on the grate becomes an echo of the poet's mind. And he said, "Only the film which flatter on the grate still flatters there, the soul unquiet thing, whose puny flaps and freaks the idling spirit by its own moods interprets everywhere, echoes or mirror seeking of itself, and makes a toy of thoughts." The peacefulness of the atmosphere and the gentle and subdued thinking of the poets are maintained throughout the poem, or kept close to each other. Not a single violent thought occurs to disturb the harmony of the poet's mind. The second points of this discussion is the autobiographical elements in the poem or an A Frost at Midnight. The stillness of the night makes the poet meditative, and his thoughts go back to the past, and he remembers his birthplace, the old church and the sweet sounds of its bells, which was the only music of the poor people. He also recollects his school days, when the flattering stranger had made him hopeful of the arrival of some friend or relative. On such occasions, in the morning he used to go and sit in his classroom with his eyes on the book, but his attention was derived to the expected arrival of some chance visitor from home. That's why he said, "But oh, how oft at school, with most believing mind, presageful have I gazed upon the bars, to watch the fluttering stranger, and as oft with any closed lids already had I dreamt of my sweet birthplace and the old church tower, whose bells the poor man's only music rang, and so on. A very similar description of Coleridge's stay at school has been given by his friend Charles Lamb in the essay Christ's Hospital 35 years ago. In this essay, Lamb says, "Oh, the cruelty of separating a poor lad from early homestead! The yearning which I used to have toward it is those unflagged years," and so on. All of us have a similar experience of our boyhood days. The face of the stern teacher, the eyes looking with mock study on the book, the snatching of a hasty glance at the door in the hope of seeing a visitor from home. These are common experiences of the boys who study in schools far away from their homes. So the autobiographical touches in the poem adds to its interest and appeal. The third point of the critical appreciation for Frost at Midnight is the attitudes of the poets towards, or the attitudes of Coleridge towards nature. Coleridge's poetry is always rich in sensuous beauty, containing sometimes a mystical radiance, which is the chief quality of Wordsworth's poetry. In his description of natural scenes, we find a vividness and accuracy of details, which show that the poet has the power of entering its spirit and reproduce it with a few deft strokes. The poem Frost at Midnight contains compact expression of his faith and belief of nature. By the time he wrote this poem, he had come under the influence of Wordsworth and was deeply impressed by his mystical pantheism. Wordsworth believed that God lived in all the objects of nature, and the influence of nature was moral as well as educative. He was very confident of his creed and expressed it in a very plain and emphatic language. Coleridge, who remained in a constant company of Wordsworth for some time, could not remain unaffected by it, and started believing in his belief, or in his doctrine. In the poem, he expresses his belief that God is present in all the objects of nature, and that his voice is articulate in the various sounds of nature. He also hopes that his son will live in constant company of nature and will learn the language of God. Thus, Coleridge said, "But though my baby shalt wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags, o'er ancient mountain, and beneath the clouds, which image in their bulk both lakes and shore, and mountain crags, so shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who from eternity doth teach." It is however to be kept in mind always that while Wordsworth always had fast to his or held fast to his belief in religion or in his doctrine, Coleridge later on changed his view and started believing that in herself nature was dead and inanimate, and we invest her with our own life and interpret our own moods in her objects. If we are happy, all the objects of nature looks to us happy and joyful, and if we are sad and dejected, all the objects of nature also appear to us in melancholy and sorrowful conditions. The most explicit statements of Coleridge's changed view of nature is to be found in A Dejection and Ode, where he said, "O lady, we received but what we gave, and in our life alone does nature live. Ours is her wedding garment, her shroud." In any way, in Coleridge's poetry, we find many beautiful descriptions of natural scenes. He was keenly alive to the beauties of nature, and his highly sensitive soul vibrated in responses to the soft and sweet charm of sounds and smells. He saw and felt the beauties of nature and was fascinated by them. Therefore, the poem Frost at Midnight also shows Coleridge's pictorial quality. In this, or in the first part of the poem, he describes very vividly, in a clear way, the frost, the owl's cry, the thin blue flame which does not quiver, and the film which flutter on the grate, the sole unquiet thing. While in the last stanza of the poem, the pictures of the earth covered with a greenness, the red breast sitting and sinking betwixt the tuft of snow and on the bare branch of a mossy apple tree, and the silent icicles quietly shining to the quiet moon, are very vivid and show the poet's minute observation of natural phenomena. The last part of the critical appreciation of this poem is the meditative quality in A Frost at Midnight. When the poem begins, we find Coleridge in deep reflective mood. The inmates of his cottage being all at rest, and his baby cradled peacefully by his side. He is virtually alone, and this puts him in a reflective mood. He finds the solitude a little oppressive. His mind is only half attuned to the influxes of nature. The beauty of the frost tracery is also lost upon him. In this dead silence, abstruser musings occupy his mind. The intellect is in command. The feeling lies dormant. The poet makes an idle toy of thoughts. But as he finds some companionship with the puny flaps and the freaks of a thin soot flake on the grate, and becomes conscious of the baby sleeping beside him, he gains a kind of reassurance, feels more secure, and we find an exquisite blending of thoughts and feelings. He gets into a reminiscent moods and gave a mature poetic expression to a whole lot of common human emotion. There is a note of nostalgia in his feeling as he refers to the day he spends at Chris's Hospital School. In those days, whenever he observed the fluttering stranger on the grate, it pretended to him the visit of someone, townsman or aunt or sister more beloved, my playmate when we both were clothed alike. The sight of his baby fills his heart with a tender gladness, and he resolves that thou shalt learn far other law and in far other scenes. He imagined that his son will be molded under the healthy formative influence of nature, and will come to love all seasons with their diverse natural beauties equally. And in the closing lines, he describes these beauties. These lines are some of the finest he ever wrote. Their composition is made possible by the harmony of himself achieves with nature. We remember that in the beginning he was vexed, but the tension gradually relaxes, and towards the close of the poem he is fully at ease with himself. And thank you for listening, for whom are interested in this little short simple presentation about Frost at Midnight by Samuel Taylor Coleridge.